I'm Harold Levine. I am co-chair of House of Peace, which is the Jewish Muslim Outreach Initiative here at CBST. Kristen Plylar-Moore, sitting in front, is my co-chair. Rabbi Marissa Alana James is our faculty advisor and will be moderating tonight. We're very excited about tonight's program. This is something that we've wanted to do since the very, very beginning of the House of Peace program. We have two remarkable Muslim LGBT thinkers, activists with us. Kamal Fizazi is an activist, lawyer, policy wonk, strategic planning and program consultant, and all-around good guy who spends his time thinking about and working on issues of human rights and equality, diversity and inclusion, democracy and social justice, gender, sexuality, public health, faith-based anti-oppression efforts, and interfaith organizing, and Lord only knows what else. An Afghan woman raised in New York City, Wazina Zondon is a sexuality educator and trainer who focuses on intersectional identities. In addition to focusing about the connections between homophobia and Islamophobia, Zondon is the co-writer and co-performer of Coming Out Muslim, Radical Acts of Love, a personal storytelling performance capturing the experience of being queer and Muslim, something that we do hope to bring to CBST sometime in the near future. And with that, Rabbi James.
So I will just add to my great joy and gratitude that Wazina and Kamal are here with us tonight by saying that I'm actually also quite grateful that we had the two historians of CBST here tonight because the history of our community is actually not that long, right? We've had a gay synagogue in New York for just over 40 years, like 45 years. That's not long. And 40 years ago, it was almost incomprehensible that we would be the community today that we are. And I can tell you for certain that my grandparents, my parents, the idea that there would one day be a whole community for whom being LGBTQ plus anything else, and also Jewish would be being twice blessed, is something they could never have imagined or would never have even thought could exist. We often hear about the Muslim community and what the tensions between Muslims and gays, or the terrible experiences of what it means to be gay in a Muslim country, or what it means, you know, for a Muslim to want to be in an LGBTQ organization. We only hear the terrible stories. But 40 years ago, one would only have heard the terrible stories of what it meant to be Jewish and queer. And so I also want to hold on tonight as we are learning from Kamal and Wazina to think about just how recent in our own history it is that for us it might have been incomprehensible to think that there are blessings in these overlapping and sometimes arguing with each other kind of identities, sometimes enhancing each other identities. And we are just incredibly privileged to have them here with us tonight. Please. Downstairs, they've made an announcement. Yeah, so people will be trickling in, and you can all tell them what I said. Yeah.
Hi everyone. Salam.
Salam.
Yeah, that makes sense to do that. Hi, thank you. So we have some slides that are just meant to help, as a teacher, help just kind of keep the conversation with what you're hearing, what you're feeling, what you're seeing kind of synced up. This is not meant in any way, shape, or form to be what we're going to read off of. Slide. It's really meant to actually, because our conversation, I would just do spacebar. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so we'll introduce ourselves, but tonight is actually just meant to be a conversation fishbowl, where we ask you to witness our conversation about most commonly heard things as queer identified Muslims, because in our thinking and our planning, we wondered what could we do, what could we talk about in the short period of time to hit on so many overlaps and also kind of silos in many ways. And thankfully, the House of Peace, Oneg, has been doing some of the intro 101 stuff, the Islam stuff, the background work that we don't necessarily have to do. And for us, we just thought, well, why don't we just talk about or talk back to the things that we often hear? whether it's from queer people, from Muslims, from people of faith, from non-people of faith. So just to kind of, because this is where the most commonly asked questions live and the most commonly asked curiosities live. My name is Wazina. I'm a sex educator and trainer, and I just want to say that as a kid who grew up in New York City, I am fangirling over Randy Weingarten because she is somebody that I knew as a kid, as a Muslim and as an Afghan child who grew up with parents who were both heavily involved in a union, SEIU. I knew who she was also as an organizer in New York City through the Empire State Pride agenda, and just as a kid who grew up as all my teachers were UFT members. Like, that's a pretty big deal. And when I'm not doing sex ed teaching, I work on a project called Coming Out Muslim, and my pronouns are she, her, they, and their.
And hi, my name is Kamal Fizazi. As Harold told you, I'm Moroccan American. I'm a lawyer and human rights activist. I focus mainly on gender, sexuality, health, and faith issues. And I'm excited to be here because I'm also an interfaith baby. My mother is an Orthodox Christian, and my father's an Orthodox Sunni Muslim. That's another thing I'd like to say, I guess. I'm a Sunni Muslim. That's maybe means something to you, maybe it doesn't, but it's worth just noting. I'm excited. I have a kind of long history with CBST. Years ago, when 9/11 happened, Rabbi Kleinbaum reached out to Faisal Elam, who's in the audience today, who is the founder of Al-Fatiha, which was one of the organizations that organized queer Muslim life in the US and in the world, and said, we would like somebody to come to our high holiday service. Is there anybody in New York from your organization who can come? Faisal reached out to me, I came, I ended up standing up when Rabbi Kleinbaum said, we have somebody here from the Muslim community, would you please stand up? I stood up in front of 3,000 people, shaking, like, what am I doing here? But really touched that the CBST had made an effort to reach out to queer Muslims and say, we have your back. This was as far back as then, and it's continued now with the House of Peace program that CBST is engaged in.
And my motivation for being here is multiple, including the interfaith work that Kamal is also committed to. But for me, it's a big part of offering a counter and/or for some of us, a narrative that we often don't hear about Muslims. For some of us, we hear a narrative about Muslims, but we don't hear a counter narrative that's pro-women, faith-loving, I choose to be Muslim, I was raised Muslim, and I choose to continue to be Muslim, and also a counter-narrative around queerness and Islam that oftentimes is co-opted, is created into like documentaries that make movies and that, yes, certain things sell, and yet some of us are thriving. And so I do want to offer that as a narrative. And part of the witnessing of our conversation is an opportunity for individuals to hear things that you might believe, that you don't want to believe, that you just don't know how to respond to, and it helps build that muscle to interrupt those moments of discomfort, because sometimes we hear these homophobic or Islamophobic, xenophobic comments, not from like people in power only, but we hear it from the people we love, our parents, our siblings, our children, the people we work with, and then that requires a different muscle to be used, a very nuanced muscle to respond. And so perhaps there's some thread in our storytelling that will kind of help in that conversation making that you do outside of here. I think next slide, I didn't memorize them. Yeah, so fishbowl conversation, you're gonna just watch us chat for a bit, and then Q&A. So we have created our slides to basically help guide us, but the most commonly heard thing that I think we often hear, I get, is like, well, doesn't the Quran say, isn't it like illegal to be gay and Muslim or something like that? Do you want to start? What do you usually say?
What do I usually say to that?
Yeah, if you engage, because I don't always engage.
Well, I did have the opportunity to be, or the experience of being interviewed by a conservative Muslim at one point who posed that question and said, how can you be a good Muslim? Can you be a good Muslim and call yourself gay? And I, in a kind of lawyerly way, kind of like had a bunch of different answers that none of which might have really responded to her question, but she was going to maybe pick one of them and maybe be satisfied, I hoped. And for one of them, I say that, first of all, if you're Orthodox, just because I say I'm gay doesn't mean you know what I do in the bedroom. So don't assume, like, I've proclaimed my identity, maybe I have desire, maybe I have romantic attraction, but just because I say I am who I say I am doesn't mean you know anything else about me, so don't start judging. I continue from that to talking about how the Quran itself starts almost every single prayer with reminding us that that Allah, or God, is most merciful and ever compassionate, and those verses and that reminder is there purposefully, that nothing in there is not purposeful. And also that Allah is closer to me than my jugular vein, so Allah knows me better. There's a verse in the Quran that says that. And it basically means God knows my intentions, God knows my history, God knows my struggles, much better than any human being could. And it is God's place to judge or not judge, not other human beings. So those are some of the things that I kind of respond with, even though, I have more responses. It just depends on how much the person really wants to engage, because they'll sometimes come back and be like, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but.
Right.
And I'm talking, this is an internal conversation, right? Like between Muslims, because this also happens externally among, how do you deal with it when it comes from somebody who's not a Muslim?
Right. But so when it comes for me from somebody who is Muslim, which interestingly, the question I have to ask is, I can tell you about the story of Lot and the revisionist, much like most Abrahamic traditions have a revision of the story of Lot. It's not necessarily about the type of sex or two men. It's about hospitality, it's about rape. So there's that. I can tell you about that. I can also tell you that there's other places within the Quran, like even when Rabbi Cohen was talking about light and the 36 individuals who carried light, I think about Nur, I think about light when it comes to Arabic, and in Surah Al-Nur, I have found for myself pockets of things that say, yes, there might be men who don't desire men, or don't desire women the way they should, ways that we interpret it, and there's many translations, and we actually have some screenshots of things. So there's that.
Is that what we have up there?
Yeah, so that one is the story of Lot. Yeah, those are the Lot verses.
So one of the things, it might be too small for you to read, but one of the things it says, and there's...
Can we read, it's just a couple of verses, do you have a copy?
I do have the copy.
Kamal has it.
And what I've done, and what is on the screenshot is actually, so there's a website called Quran.com, so you can read the Quran for yourself online anytime you want. It's also, they have transliteration available. You can click on the transliteration so you can read what it sounds like in Arabic. There's a way you can click on a thing and it'll play it for you so you can hear what it's recited like. And it also has different translations. So you can click on all the different translations you want. And in reading the different translations, you get to see where one translation maybe interpreted the Quran a certain way. Like if you're not reading, because you don't speak Arabic fluently or don't speak Quranic Arabic fluently, you can read the translations and get the in-between meaning that maybe gives you some comfort. So in this one, in the story of Lot, at 26:165, there's like, do you come, of all the creatures in the world, will you approach males? And that's not exactly how I read, I guess that is how I read that.
I don't read that.
The Arabic. What of all the creatures do you come up unto the males? It's like, why do you come? And it's addressing, theoretically, men, right? So it's not addressing women about their desire for men. It's addressing men and their desire for men, theoretically. But it follows it up with saying, why do you leave what your Lord has created for you as mates, but you are a people transgressing? Or in another translation, but you are an aggressive people. So there are two theories in that interpretation. One, I would say...
God hates a butch.
That definitely, I say, it recognizes that maybe we have a spouse or a mate that we're meant to be with, and what's being condemned is the approach of others outside of that relationship. So that's possibly one interpretation. And another one is that it's about the aggressiveness of the approach. It's not about approaching somebody for a consensual sexual relationship contractually, where you have an agreement between each other, since all sexual relationships in Islam are very contractual. Like you have rights and responsibilities. Even in the traditional heterosexual marriage, even if a woman gets divorced and has a child 2 years after her divorce, that child is still considered the child of her husband through the sleeping baby theory. There's just like a bunch of different stuff that works through that is meant to be protective, not condemning. Mm-hmm. So that's how I read those two. When I read those, I think I'm not the best theologian, and I'm not a theologian, but I find that I can say there's a different interpretation. I don't necessarily share your interpretation. You don't have the right to impose your interpretation on me. Mm-hmm. That's part of what I say.
Yeah, for me, there's contextual stuff, but the truth is, and so I do want to include that within some Quranic interpretations, there are also places for trans and gender nonconforming people to also have affirmation of their identities and their beings. My recap is that the soul stays the way it's meant to be, but the body can shift. And so for me, this is a reading, and for many of us, that it allows for trans people, should they want, or GNC people, to have their bodies match their souls, but the soul is always the same, and the body is different, can shift. That for me, as a woman, as a cis woman, for me, there is never anything in the Quran that really captured my same gender loving stuff. And so and honestly, as a person, I didn't grow up thinking that the Quran was a place that I needed to go to or for affirmation of my sexual orientation, because I knew that God put it inside of me. Right. And so much like God put in my inability to focus sometimes, or other things, and my love of cartwheels, right? God put in my love of whoever I fell in love with, right? So this was something that I didn't feel was dissonant internally, but for many of us, we might choose, an 80% of faith, to find this agreement in text. And if I find my agreement in text, the truth is I could talk to another Muslim and they're like, they don't agree with my sources of kindness in Quran. And so what happens when, even if we can give you all this evidence, right, but what if you don't believe in my evidence, right? Because that's not how you interpret it. That's not what holds true for you. But the truth is we continue to exist. And so for me, there's this kind of in between. What happens if I give it to you and you don't like it? And the truth is, so what do we do with those individuals of faith who don't then stand or co-sign our ability or our desire to be Muslims or call ourselves Muslims? And sometimes there's the people who are Muslim who kind of push back, right, and there's the people who are non-Muslim who push back. And that's where it's really hard for me as a queer Muslim, is that sometimes I don't think queer people or people who are not Muslim realize they have so much more in common with the haters. Like, you have more in common, like the two different sets of haters have more in common than even than my community members. And so that's, for me, this is a place to think about. As a Sunni Muslim, which I also, again, want to co-sign this piece, that we are very like Sunni privileged within the many kind of versions, iterations, and interpretations of Islam for people who are Shia, Sufis, and even within Sufi and Shia identities, there's multiples of us, folks who claim they're the right ones, the true ones, all the different ways. But within Hadith, like the stories that were collected from the Prophet also never said that if somebody was gay or trans, that they should have violence put against them, or they were always meant to be treated lovingly. And so for me, that's also a place of, I don't know, affirmation, kindness, peace, solace, that I go to or try to offer somebody who's trying to interpret the Quran for them, like, or a family member or somebody else who's Muslim who's struggling with this. Should that be a place where they need to, right, I don't know, find that, I don't know, something?
I think some of the comfort in terms of the life of the Prophet is used by a lot of Muslims to be a guide, or it's suggested to be a guide to how we're supposed to live our lives. And the Prophet was known to be, or in the stories that we tell in our traditions, known to be kind, considerate, compassionate, patient, just generous, just a lot of positive things. He was still a human being and still recognized to be a human being, but I think that, for me, there was a story that is told of how there were men who, and this is another area where there's an interpretation issue, either men who did not have desire for women, or men who no longer had desire, were no longer capable of desire, theoretically maybe because they were older, or men who were eunuchs, who neither born eunuchs or medically made into eunuchs. And we don't know whether, does this term, is that an understanding of transgender? Is that an understanding of homosexuality, of not having the same desire for the opposite sex or for a different sex? So the story goes that the prophet had one of these men in his household who took care of the women in his household, or guarded them. And at one point, one of the men who fit this category of not having desires for women apparently was noticing the attributes of one of the women of the household, meaning he was looking at her a little bit more than he should have if he really didn't care. That person was no longer employed in that role. There was no violence. They were removed from their position, but that means that other men in that situation stayed. There were other men like that, and there wasn't any violence committed against this person for having it. They just were no longer considered a person who didn't have desire for the women, a man who didn't have desire for women. So I think that's a story that doesn't often get told, and I'm not telling it in the best way, but it exists. I think there's also I find the story, it's coming up, I don't know if it's the next slide. That's just a slide of the Quran.com that shows how you can set the translations. Oh, there it is. So one of the things that I often say is, we hear a lot, growing up as a kid, I never heard the story of Lot. It wasn't something that was taught to me.
Is this the same story we have?
It's similar, the same story. It's similar to it, and if you go to chapter 26 or Surah 26, there's a story of a bunch of different prophets, and it starts off with Abraham, and it keeps going. It gets to Lot, and then it goes on to other prophets as well. And so the story that's immediately after the story of Lot in this surah or chapter is about the people of Midian, who supposedly also denied. Every story comes, a prophet comes to tell the people about God. People, they don't listen, they're punished, right? The story repeats itself, but in each case, sometimes it's a different issue that happens. And in this case, the people of Midian were known to corrupt weights and measures, so they committed fraud. They were also destroyed like the people of Lot. And I bring up this story whenever somebody asks me, well, what about Lot? And it's like, well, do you have the same passion for the people of Midian? Mm-hmm. Do you even know the people of Midian? Or
do you hate interest like I do?
Yeah, right? Do you hate interest like I do? Do you hate fraud and corruption? And we do, as Muslims, we are against injustice and oppression, but we don't necessarily talk about the story of Midian the same way that we talk about the story of Lot. There isn't the same passion, the same emotional connection.
We can do next slide. What's that? That's, I think, story Midian. Okay, so the next most commonly heard thing is, so why would you choose to stay in a religion that is, oftentimes for me, is why would you stay in a religion that's so anti-woman and anti-gay? And again, this is one comment slide, this question from Islamophobes, racists, progressives, so-called progressives, other people of faith, queer people of faith, people who have no faith, but somehow are obsessed with my religion or my religiosity or how religiously good I am, which creates so much isolation and pain because then you find yourself wedged between not just a rock and a hard place, but a pebble and a New Yorker and blah, 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 right? All these others. So you're like, how do I exist? For me, I have to always say that, right? The same thing, God put all this inside of me. And also, I grew up within a family, whether or not, and much like, I didn't hear the story of Lot. I went to masjid or mosque growing up, but none of these things about being queer, none of this was, or that it's not okay to be gay, was never used as a tool or a form of oppressiveness in any way, shape, or form. The only things that I learned about Islam was that, or many of the things, that was like religion, or the reasons for why my parents were so hellbent on my education was because of Islam, that I had to be an excellent student because as a girl, all of their children, all the two genders that they identified for their children, my brother and I had to be excellent in education. Equity was the cornerstone or the foundation of how they were to raise me. And yes, their weird and or cultural double standards for their son and their daughter, my brother's name is Adam, right, was that it wasn't a religious reason, it was a cultural reason. And this is also the same distinction that I think many of us as people of faith who maybe also be Jewish or other identities, there's a difference between the cultural expressions, the secular expressions, the religious expressions of our faith, and there's cultural things that inform our faith and the religious things that inform our cultures, but being a woman and having sexism affect me isn't just a Muslim thing. It's a larger patriarchal, misogynistic thing. It's not just a singular Muslim thing. Hijab, chadar, veiling was not something that I had to do. It was something I could do if I wanted to do it. And the story that I usually tell my friends is that I grew up in New York City and wanting my parents to write me letters for why I couldn't wear shorts at Bayside High School. But my parents were like, no, wear shorts. Like, go wear shorts. I was like, no, you have to tell me I'm Muslim, I have to wear sweatpants. And it wasn't. It didn't work, and I wish it did. I hated shaving. But I also wasn't allowed to shave. That was the other problem. So, like, they didn't really get it right.
Yeah, for me, and I grew up in Morocco, which is 99% Muslim country, with the other population being non-citizens who are Christian and Hindu and maybe of other religions, and then a small minority of Jews who are Moroccan. The Constitution recognizes only Judaism and Islam as state religions, or as religions. So you can only be a citizen if you're one of those two religions. You can't, yeah. I grew up with my father telling me all the time, like, Islam's main message is moderation. Like, moderation, moderation, moderation. Like how you treat people, what you do, everything is just about moderation and tolerance and understanding, like compassion towards others. I remember him, we lived on a main thoroughfare, and people would walk there. Now I understand that they were poor, that they couldn't afford public transit, but like they would walk and ring our doorbells and ask for a glass of water. And my father would explain that it's an Islamic obligation. When somebody asks you for water, you offer it. Now imagine what this means when you're coming, like in the desert, somebody asks you for water and you offer it. Like if you have to share, this is the hospitality that's violated in the story of Lot, right? You have to offer things that are life-sustaining, water, not, refuse people. And I also, why would I stay? My social justice values, I'm a human rights activist and lawyer, and my social justice values come from Islam. Like I wouldn't care about justice and fairness the way that I do, and dignity and autonomy and human rights, if it wasn't from how I was raised being told these things were important. And it's hard, like I can't take that out of me. That's in me.
Right. For many of us, and I don't know if this has happened, this is something you considered, but for many of us who, any queer or trans GNC identified person, there might be a moment, if you were raised with faith, that this is the reason why you can't be trans, or you can't be queer, or you can't, right? For many of us, religion can be used as a tool or a reason for why you shouldn't or can't be, or it's not okay to be not hetero and not cisgendered. And I know for a long moment I considered maybe I need to like leave my religion, or I'm just gonna not be Muslim. I was raised Muslim, but I'm not gonna be Muslim actively because I probably can't be. And there's a good chunk of time where I think I decided that I would, or tried to wear this identity of I will just be queer, or I'll just be within my like non-Muslim space and be fully out. And yet it felt like cutting the roots off my body. So if I'm a leaf of my parents, without my roots, I would be withering. And so there was a long time where then I decided that, you know what, I would rather be half myself. I would just be a closeted version of myself. And by closeted, I'm not closeted, we just don't talk about it, which I'm down to not talk about it. If I can fully be myself and have access to my roots and the water and the fuels and all the analogies and metaphors, I would, and then this is the place where I find the most peace, that I can fully be myself here versus just a sliver of myself here, where I also find myself explaining so much of my identity. And that's for many of us, it's not just a Muslim thing, it's not just like a brown thing, it's many of us who have these multiple identities where you have to then explain it to the folks who don't share any commonality with you. This is the beauty of having something on a Friday, the beauty of Ummah, the beauty of a congregation is that you don't know anybody, but you have this like really do you have this commonality that's inexplicable? And that's part of it. As part of coming out Muslim, we always start with a prayer. We start with the azan, the call to prayer, and we do it in the voice, in a woman's voice. We've done it with purpose. And for many Muslims, queer people particularly, who see coming out Muslim, who may have not been in a queer plus Muslim space ever, and who have left their faith, hearing the azan in the most unfamiliar sound, which is a woman's voice, oftentimes it's this wash of, I can't deny why I'm so moved by this.
Yeah.
And I think that might be the same for many people in this space who if you come to services here or wherever if you have a place where you have community and faith together, it's something you can't remove yourself if it's meant to be your path, to be a religious person.
I have a similar experience, well, in the sense that a few years back, I went to a retreat that was organized by the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity. We'll get to resources in a bit, but they organized an annual retreat for LGBTQ Muslims, and one of the things that they did there was have a woman call the adhan, and I started crying. I didn't even realize how much it moved me. It felt like something was being healed within me that I didn't even understand was broken, that the exclusion of women from spiritual space or spiritual leadership was something that harmed me. Like, as a cisgender man, it harmed me. And having it be corrected or rectified in this queer Muslim space was really moving to me, and it brought me back closer to my faith in a way that I hadn't expected it to.
Should I do next slide?
Yeah.
The next slide. So this one, it's still like hashtag too soon, right? Like, did you know 9/11 was going to happen? But I say this, and we connected these two slides, this kind of segues that for many Muslims, queer or not, or however you identify, 9/11 was an opportunity in one messed up way to say, like, to return to our faiths, to Islam, because it had been co-opted by some people, for people who were claiming it for themselves, and you're like, oh no, I know better than this, right? Or no, this does not speak for Islam, this does not speak for me, even though some of us were like, I've been out of the picture for a while. But this, I'm not lying to you, when 9/11 happened, I grew up in New York City, but I was going to school in SUNY New Paltz. It was only an hour and a half away. And a political science, international relations major, people, again, who knew better, were like, did you know 9/11 was going to happen, right? As an Afghan, and as a woman, and as other people, I was like, are you? Yeah, and like people knowledgeable, smart, educated people. But this could also be, similarly, we hear this question over and over again. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all the things, blah, blah, blah. And I'm glad it can feel kind of light and jokey in this moment, but it's pretty heavy to have that. But 9/11 brought many of us back to our faiths, because when you watch CNN, when you watch whatever it is we watch, and there's a terrorist thing happening, most people do not say, oh, homeboy who ran that car, that Muslim guy that ran a car into a bunch of people, he's a bad Muslim. But non-Muslims, Muslims, and people will be like, can you actually be a good Muslim if you're gay? I'm like, nobody's asking the terrorist if he's a good Muslim, but they ask us, just for many other reasons, if we are actually good enough at Islam, but that person doesn't get questioned. And that has to do with who paints the narrative, who tells the story, who tells the news, but we are also consumers of that, and that thing gets kind of very embedded in us. And so this is a big one. I know, did you know 9/11 was going to happen could have also been another one, was like round them all up, or
my story. I was in New York for 9/11, and I did know it was happening or about to happen. I missed the memo, but I was walking.
There was no Twitter back then.
I mean, I've heard, and the thing is, I've heard people say that about Jews too. Like, there was the same story going out. It's like, oh, the Jews were told to stay home and not take the train that day because they knew that it was happening. Like, the conspiracy theories abound, like, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, like, there's similar patterns. But so what happened, what Wazina's referring to about the round them up was, I was in New York and working in the 40s on Fifth Avenue or Lexington, staying in Chelsea at the time, and had to walk home because they closed all the subways, right? So everything got shut down. We were sent home from work, and as I was walking home down Fifth Avenue, these people who were clearly disheveled, like dust in their hair, obviously coming up from the World Trade Center, I overhear one of them say, "We need to round all those Arabs up." Now, it brings two things, right? Like one, it's the merger of Arab and Muslim, which not all Arabs are Muslim, not all Muslims are Arab. That's its own little Islamophobia trap to fall into. The next day, we went back to work. We were allowed back to work. Go up in the elevator. Somebody standing next to me says to the person they're talking to, "We need to round up all those Muslims." And then there's a third time that happened, and it was just like the fear was so great, and it didn't happen, but it started happening in other ways. Like that's when we started having people did disappear in communities, and there was rounding up that did happen. So I mean, it didn't happen to me, but
Yeah. And it wasn't just something that this didn't affect, and this thing doesn't just affect Muslims or people who look like they're Muslim, but it also affects people that look like they're Muslim but they're not Muslim. Sikhs and men of color with beards that might be in no way affiliated with Islam but look a particular way. And so whether it's ICE and Homeland Security coming in to surveil and or infiltrate communities, but it also continues to affect us because the backlash and the ripple effect of 9/11 and the occupation of countries continues to happen in the name of that, in the name of what happened on 9/11, and yet I think we forget that this is still rippling and affecting us day in and day out. And the one thing I do want to say is that if people are concerned or thinking about 9/11 or these things, jihad is oftentimes a word that's thrown around for what happened or this was in the name of jihad. And the truth being that, right, that is not what jihad means. Jihad is actually any Muslim who's standing up for justice, taking action, having a conversation that changes hearts and minds is the truest jihad, which is the jihad of the self, the soul, the work you do to better yourself and to better your community. There's also the jihad of the pen or pencil, I don't know, right? For individuals who are taking to education and changing hearts and minds through that way. Jihad is not war. There's another word in Arabic for war. This is not that. So there's multiple levels of jihad, but the greatest jihad you could have is not with individuals, it's with your own self. And that's the beauty, I think, for me about Islam is that even if you're queer and somebody says you're not meant to be gay, that sin is that thing that sets you apart from God, and you're meant to be set apart from God. You're not meant to actually be this perfect being. You're meant to be struggling consistently and insisting on being your better version through whatever struggle thing that gets put in your face.
that reminds me of that interrogator that I told you about who was conservative and asked me a whole bunch of questions and whether I could be a good Muslim, said, do you think this is a test for you? Like, do you think being LGBTQ is a test? And I was like, well, maybe it is. Maybe it's a test for me, but maybe it's also a test for you. Maybe it's a test for society, because Islam teaches us to have just societies, to fight oppression, all these different things. Like, is how you're treating me or how society treats queer people and trans people just? Is that an anti-oppressive system? Or is this something that maybe we're here to let you see what it is that you're still not doing right?
Next slide.
Yeah.
So this one's similar, #WeAreOrlando. So this is not right, but this was a major kind of 9/11 2.0 in its own way for queer people and queer Muslims. I know I made I just got don't say 2.0, that's really old. Thanks. But we are Orlando. No, we're not all Orlando. Want to say that. And this was, again, a reminder that as queer Muslims, as queer people, we'd been talking for a very long time. We've been doing this thing for a long time, and nobody was listening. But when Orlando happened, it was this amazing, convenient moment to re-presence queer Muslim voices, but only when they served a particular narrative. I am tired, and there's many of us in this space that are the people who are always asked to talk when a queer plus Muslim convenience happens, to counter the deficit perspective of Muslims. Like, somehow, queer and Muslim, our voices are only used when it's helpful to say that, no, like to offer this way of thinking about Islam, being like, no, but look at these cool, radical, Americanized versions of Muslims. They're gay. We're like, we've been around. They've been around for a long time. We didn't even call ourselves gay. Some of us don't even have the word gay, right? But for me, We Are Orlando was this reminder that people have not been looking at these conversations intersectionally. They've not been looking at the intersections of faith, religion. And I told Kamal this when we were planning. I was like, I don't even know how many times I talked to somebody press-wise, and they're like, oh, Wazina, can you tell us about this Afghan guy who, like, what made him be so, tell us about your culture that made him so violent. I was like, yeah, homeboy grew up in America. He is a product of masculine toxicity, and they were not happy. And in fact, they were kind of annoyed that I was like telling them all these things, and I was like, yeah, and he's an American. He grew up in Flushing and moved to Florida. Not abnormal. I mean, look at the man who's the president, right? Like, same, toxic terribleness. And yet people were really uncomfortable with the fact that I wasn't implicating Islam or my religion or my culture as the source for what happened, or for the source for why he was closeted. It's not just Islam that made him closeted, or just being Afghan that made him closeted, or like the pressures of being married that made him closeted. It was like all these things, and more than made him closeted, potentially, and be hateful and self-hating. We Are Orlando.
Yeah. I mean, we are all Orlando in the sense that we all felt attacked. We all are vulnerable. I mean, I think part of what I see there is Muslims are very often easily painted as or easily seen as perpetrators and never victims. So I don't know who attended that, who went to Orlando. I don't know if there are any queer Muslims who went and danced there and, ended up shot. But I remember at 9/11, there were Muslims who died too. But the only way that we remember 9/11 in terms of who was Muslim and who wasn't is Muslims are the attackers, never the victims.
I'm looking at we got a late start.
Yeah.
We can be here for a while longer. I want to make sure that we have, I'm sure there are a lot of questions outside.
Okay.
I went through your slides. You have some terrific other slides.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to go through
Where
this.
are
Yeah,
we? Should we move
got you.
forward?
Thanks, Harold. So, where are all the advanced Muslims, which I think is what, where are the advanced Muslims like you? AKA, you mean cute. Thanks.
Well, I will say one thing. I do identify as a progressive Muslim, which means something to me personally, but I also understand that there's, as I said, my father stressed moderation. He was just a traditional Orthodox Muslim. He also didn't pray that often. Like, he was Orthodox, but he didn't pray. It was kind of an interesting contradiction there. But when one of my best friends died, actually speaking of Queens and gun violence, so I had a queer Muslim friend who was shot and killed in Queens, and we went to his burial. His burial was held, the janazah service, which is the funeral service, was held at a traditional mosque in Brooklyn. Just like we looked for an Islamic mosque to hold a janazah. We found one, we went to one. It was like 10 or 12 queer, somewhat flamboyant, I'll say that word for myself, like people showing up in this space. Everybody looked at us kind of like, who are you? But, we still went and we prayed. When it came time for the prayer service, specifically over the body, everybody in the congregation participated, and the imam dealt with the widower, right? Because this man, my friend, was married to another man, went with a New York State death certificate, had to present that to the imam. The imam, who was clearly Orthodox, dealt with him just like he would have dealt with anybody else, like with the same kindness and compassion. And it reminded me that I have my own internalized attitude sometimes about what it means to be Orthodox, that it's not always true, that the pureness of Orthodoxy can also mean these values that are upheld. But what I mean when I say I'm a progressive Muslim is that I understand Islam to have provided a floor. Like, Islam provides a minimum, like what is minimally acceptable, minimum rights, minimum wrongs. But you can build above that. So for example, as societies get better, since we're supposed to be building societies that are anti-oppressive, greater injustice, growing injustice, is that you have a minimum, but you keep building increasing rights. And that's, to me, a progressive understanding that is an Orthodox understanding. So you can be, moderate Muslim or progressive Muslim is also sometimes an Orthodox Muslim.
And the thing I would say is that most Muslims are moderate. Most American Muslims who live in, right, and American Muslims don't just mean like brown, South Asian-y Arab people, right? Black Muslims have been living in this country for centuries and centuries, right? The fabric of the progressiveness, the advancedness, the Americana-ness of our country, and we oftentimes, they're highly invisible and also ignored as, or also not seen as Muslim, right? Or not deemed as like that sort of Muslim, but they're seen as like Black Americans. So I want to like presence that piece. And we know all reports, Pew reports show and say, right, that American Muslims vote more progressively or liberally than Christian counterparts. And so I just want to just put that there. And this is an American thing, but also Muslim majority countries around the globe have pretty pro-LGBT or LGBT affirming or at least not anti-LGBT policies and practices as much as we do. Some places do, some places don't. But Muslim majority countries aren't as narrow as we are on LGBT issues. So I just want to offer that element. Next one. Oh, is there a CBST equivalent for Muslims?
Yes. There are several, but I mean, they're smaller. They're not quite, maybe they're not equivalent in the sense of they don't have their own building, they haven't been around 40 years, but there are several organizations that exist. There's the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity that exists, that holds a retreat once a year that brings people together. And from that retreat, people have gone into different cities where they live. In Boston, there's a community, in Chicago, in Seattle, in Dallas, in LA. There's also a progressive Muslim movement or organization that has LGBTQ welcoming spaces and gender equal prayer spaces. So, and there's one of the slides, I don't know if it's the next one or further along. This is one, so this is a mosque that exists in Chicago, Masjid al-Rabia, and it's, if you follow the next, the slide, sorry, it's on the right hand, so you can't see what it says there, but it's their pillars of inclusivity. They're women-centered, anti-racist, LGBTQI affirming, pluralist, and accessible. Like they have 5 points of principles that organize their existence. And they're online. They're going to be, one of the things that you'll see later is, or you got a handout of resources. They're on that list of resources. They're on there.
The other thing I'll add is that the personalization and the beauty of Islam, for many of us, that it's one-on-one, right? It's there's no for Sunni, as a Sunni, it's one-on-one. For me, it's very personalized. Like, I don't feel the necessity to be at a masjid or to go to Friday services, or in general, it's between me, myself, Allah. Should I use a tezbah, my equivalent of a rosary? Should I pray 5 times a day? Should I do my own Quranic study? That's a personal partnership between me and God, which is a place of solace, because then it's always with me. Even if my parents, who are the people I learned Islam from, are not around at some point, or I don't have access to them, that's where I can go if I don't have access to a community. And the imperfection of our human state is what I think Allah has allowed, is like so beautiful, is that you don't do it right, you don't always get it right, and then you return, and God never says no, and God never turns your back on you. And that's the thing for me that's, that's why I stay, and that's why I think I feel so healthy in Islam. Next slide. Oh, yeah.
So those resources. So there's a list of resources, which I have to find.
I think, yeah.
You guys have.
Yeah, there's a.
So I will say, there's a handout that you got. We will be sending this handout out as an attachment with clickable links to everyone who has the House of Peace list, and we will also be posting it on the House of Peace section on the CBST website, because there's a lot of URLs in here.
Yeah.
You're welcome to enter all of them if you want, or when you get it, you can just click through. But can you
Clicking.
brief out
Well,
what's on there?
one of the ones that I want to point out is, since I said I'm not a theologian, that somebody in there is a theologian who wrote a piece that's in there, that's a good read, And then there's also somebody who's not a theologian, but who wrote a good rebuttal to homophobic arguments article, and that's in there. So it's not, we're not saying, even though we're saying that for us personally, or at least I'm saying for me personally, that I find Islam to be a source of strength and something that's just something I can't separate out of my being, I know that there are arguments out there that are made. So some of the counter-arguments are available in the resource list.
Yeah, and this virtual ummah or community has been essential for many of us who didn't know where to find ourselves, and we spent many years thinking we were the only ones. And I remember being 17 and finding out about this group called Al-Fatiha, and it was only this like listserv, was an email list, and one of the people, the leads of this group is here, Faisal, who I remember just years ago being like, oh yeah, it's the only way we can survive is to be online and never see each other in person, because I mean, if we gather, someone's going to definitely know you're together, and like, you know, God's going to strike down. It was all this self-hating stuff. But like the beauty of in the virtual existence, now we get to be human existence together, is just, that's why all these multiplicity of sites exist, is because people are still somewhere, even in the Bronx, somewhere, thinks they're the only gay Muslim they've ever. And that's the fascinating sadness of this also, is that many of us still think we're the only one.
Right. And I do want to say, so the resource list also includes a number of organizations that exist in countries that are Muslim majority. So there's an organization in Tunisia, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in, in Bosnia, in Albania, in Sudan and Egypt, in Canada, in Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country, in Israel and Palestine, in South Africa, and then there's a global network. And there's, you can scroll through them and check them out. I mean, that'll be just, none of these, I mean, I'd like to say that the Tunisia case is one that's really interesting to me. They're recently considering removing their criminalization of same-sex sexual activity, which they do have. So they're talking about removing that law, and the LGBTQ community in Tunisia successfully was able to push back against the police's practice of anal testing, which they were doing. They were using tests, they were probing people's behinds to see whether or not they had sex. So that's, yeah, I mean, the police in Tunisia. They're no longer doing it now, but that is, so that's just to say that there are some things that do happen in these countries that are not positive, but there's also stuff being done to push back against it.
So allyship, a call for allyship, and interfaith allyship. You can do the next slide. And the next slide for me is a big one. I think it was an aha moment that I had talking with Kamal, was that as Muslims, we ask for our allies of faith and people in faith, whether or not you are a person of faith, to support Muslims, all the different communities of Muslims, in holding space for us to get to the place we need to be without replicating the successes of Christianity, the successes of the different sects within Christianity, the successes of Judaism. There may never be a CBST equivalent, but there may be a version of Islam that is meant to be the version for us where we are. And so this is just my own thinking about all movements. We are not to replicate each other's work, but are meant to like support and model and hold space. And that's kind of like a request that I think I'm making. And then as we think about, there's no one singular best practice at all. And thank you for hosting us, your radical Muslims.
Yeah.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Mike? Hello. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. I would ask that people ask just one question, and they don't start with a statement. It's just a plain question that can have an answer. Jerry?
Quick question. You said at the beginning that more Orthodox Muslims would be somewhat acceptable or understanding of the mate concept, but they wouldn't have an understanding of how you get there. How do you resolve those?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's actually something that heterosexual Orthodox Muslims also deal with, in terms of, that there is a both at the same time as there are some really progressive notions into some, there's also some conservative ones, or ones that I would call conservative, and sexual relationships are not permissible. So dating is okay. Like, I just remembered as a youth not dating, like being really pure and not dating somebody of the opposite sex, because if I dated, I'd have to get married. Like, it would just be such an automatic thing. So I just didn't date, which was great for me as somebody not wanting to explore their own sexuality. But I think the way that they do it, I think it's a very interesting, they do it very purely. They do it, they're chaperoned, they hang out in groups maybe, I don't know, I've broken lots of rules, I'll just put it that way. I don't know.
Marty.
So, on a personal level, how are your families your choices?
I'm just going to repeat this for our live streamers. On a personal level, how do your family, how accepting are your families of your lives, choices?
You go first.
It's a continuous evolution and growth. My parents both know that I'm queer and have gotten evidence of it. Sadly, through seeing like film by mistake, like a documentary by mistake. Like they've known because of my telling them in other ways, but have seen very public evidence of it, and other family members putting that in their face. And interestingly, the place of connection or somehow growing was understanding that why is a family member putting Wazina's public stuff or saying things like, what about the things about Wazina on the internet? And my parents then having this moment of like, why would this sibling of mine rub this in my face if they know this is a sore subject? And that was a moment to say they're not proud of it, but understanding that Wazina doesn't put this in our face, why would you? Because I try to be very kind to my parents and protect them in some ways by not, but we don't talk about it, which again, that is also a place of growth. We don't talk about it, but they also don't throw it in my face. It's not a blow up contentious thing. But my sisters are also straight, and they don't talk about their dating. So this kind of like very like desexualized thing is a thing in my family and for many of us. So we don't talk about that in general. But overall, they're okay.
So I came out when I was 19, which is 25 years ago now. I can't believe it's been 25 years. And when I came out to my parents, my mother said 4 things. She said, everybody's bisexual. Why do you have to tell anybody? You should just marry I don't remember the third one, but the fourth one was, great, now no woman will take my place in your life.
Oh.
That's weird. Yeah. My father said he wouldn't say anything because he didn't want to say anything that he might regret later. So he kind of like kept quiet. Yeah. And then we proceeded to fight for the next 8 years. So it wasn't easy, but they never disowned me, right? They were like, you're still our son, we still love you. But they were like, why are you doing this, why are you doing this? He eventually came around and was like, okay, I understand, I accept now that it's not something you can choose. It's something, this is who you are. And I was like, and that there's nothing wrong with it. He made two statements. One, you don't have a choice, and there's nothing wrong with it. And I asked him, well, if there's nothing wrong with it, then why does it matter if it's my choice or not? Like, what if I did choose it? If there's nothing wrong with it, why does it matter? And he's like, well, in that case, I would be upset because that would mean you didn't listen to me because I'm your father, and I'm your father. And that was, and the other thing I would say about my dad was that when I first came out, my sister got married around the time that I came out, and my mom told me, your father will never accept your male choices in this house. And it was again the language of choice. Years later, my father would jokingly call me up and just say, don't forget to invite me to your wedding. So there was an evolution that happened. And even today, when I posted on Facebook that I was coming to this talk, one of my cousins that I never came out to her, put it on Facebook, oh, I love Kamal, I'm so proud of him. So there's been an evolution and a shift in the family, and it's taken time.
Other questions? Yes.
Wazina, I wanted to thank you for inspiring the idea that you can stand ground and keep in the faith. I'm a their spirituality?
Where I think it's at the places like the HMIs and the LA Fournay centers and the LGBT centers, where young people are coming to find community. Maybe they had community in their faith, in the church or the places where they worshipped, if they did, and even if they didn't worship there, there's a good chance that many of us find ourselves unsure as where we're going, or if we're going to go home tonight, or if I'm going to go home tonight, but it's not going to feel good because the people who we live with are maybe using religion against us, and so it's in those places, and offering that there's our kind, loving, and for me, interfaith spaces are the safest places to go for young people, to bring them or to let them know that I'm doing this thing, because it also helps dismantle this thought that, if I'm queer, there's no place for me with God, but I'm not ready to think about Catholicism yet, but there are Jews that love gays, that's awesome, right? There's that piece that is it offers that kind of element, and it restores a place for them to find their faith when they're ready, or whenever the case may be. That's the big part for me.
Yeah, I would just add, just agree about the interfaith piece, given that, especially now, since we're under attack, or at least as Muslims and as Jews, there seems to be so much hate. It's an opportunity to do work together and to have CBST show up in Muslim spaces saying we're here and we support our Muslim siblings. That helps, I think, the people have the conversations or start having the thoughts. You know.
We have time for one last question, Gary.
This lesson that you mentioned, do you feel condescended by that a little bit? On Friday afternoon, to have Jewish people say we love you and
Well, I'll add.
The question was one that we get and we raise ourselves. We show up every Friday at the Islamic Center at NYU, and the question is, do the people at the Islamic Center feel that we're condescending to them? Well, these poor, these poor Muslims need us standing there. And I will say that we've asked them, and we've said, at the point where we outstay our welcome, or we're not helping any longer, please let us know, and we'll go. And they have said, with open eyes, how could you possibly think that? We've been told over and over and over again, no, it's important that you're there. We can't believe you keep on coming. We love that you're there. And we're conscious of that fact, but I think that what we've been told is, no, the allyship is important. But I will then throw it over to Rabbi James.
And I will also just say that since the last time we approached the leadership at the Islamic Center at NYU to ask, is this something that is still welcome and helpful for you? Since then, I think every single Friday somebody has brought us cookies. Yeah. So I think that actually might be, yes, including today, which I think might be an indication that they really want to make sure that we know that they mean it.
And I will say that we are obviously the LGBT congregation. For the first couple of weeks, we could say, well, maybe they don't know that we're the gay congregation. Maybe they don't know that everybody on the sidewalk there is gay or lesbian identified. It's been a year. And I've talked to people in the community, and they're like, yeah, we know. We know what CBST is. We know who all of you are, and you're all welcome. And if you want to come up and worship with us, that's great. And here's a cookie, and we'll come to CBST one day, too. They haven't, we've been waiting. They have not, and I don't think that they will say, and we welcome our LGBT friends from CBST, we're standing outside. I don't think they feel that it needs to be said. I think that instead of saying it, they've shown it. We have all spoken to Imam Latif as he has walked by, and I don't know how he could be any friendlier, any more supportive, or any more loving of us. We have gone up there and listened to sermons about different people walking different walks. And I think that is what he says, and that is his way of telling us that we are welcome in his congregation.
So Kamal and Wazina, could I ask you both to just, is there something that if we take nothing away from tonight that you hope that we will take away? Or if it can be less profound than that, if you want to, answer, if there's something that you didn't answer as fully as you would have liked to, or anything else that's in your heart just for a last few.
I think the only thing I would say is that the same way there's a multiplicity of ways to be LGBTQI and Jewish, there's a multiplicity of ways to be queer and Muslim, or LGBTQI and Muslim, and I think that no singular person has a monolithic way of owning any narrative. There's no singular narrative or story.
Rabbi.
I just want to thank you both so much for being here, all of you for joining us, everybody from House of Peace who's here tonight. And I think you've said many profound things in the personalization of the story. One that I think is the hardest for people to understand that I want to repeat. Liberation doesn't mean it looks the same for other people as it does for you, whoever you are. It's a disease of Americans to think that way. It's a disease of the Western world to think of that way. It's a disease of white people to think that way. And to the extent any of us are in those categories, we think that way. And I've spent time in Palestine with the LGBT community, and one of the strongest messages that they've sent to me is don't assume their way of being gay is going to have rainbow flags hanging outside of a window just because we in New York or we have a certain way. And I think you've said it to us very gently, and I can say it a little bit more strongly, which is it's every human being isn't the same. Like sometimes we think the world is, we're all exactly the same with one thin layer on the outside that's different, like an onion. And we just take that one layer off and every culture is the same and every community is the same and all, it's just, well, there's one superficial level. Well, it turns out to be much more complicated than that. And real liberation takes place when we stand and we say, this is who I am. I really want to know who you are. I really want to understand what your world is. And not have the disease of, when will you look like me, and then I will welcome you. That is a disease, and part of really doing deep spiritual work is being able to stand in our place and say, yes, this is who I am. But liberation for somebody else will not exactly look the same for them as it does for me. And will I have the vision and the expansiveness to be able to accept that and learn from it and recognize if I'm taking up too big a footprint and not allowing other people to have their own footprints. And that's a struggle. It's the hardest thing in the world is to really look at somebody else and say, wow, there are ways we're the same, I get it, we have a lot of, and there are ways we're different. And those differences are exciting and we have a lot of curiosity about it rather than, when you're exactly like me, then I'll understand you or I'll like you. Well, it takes a lot more. And so you've really helped in a deep way. And we want to, in a deep way, welcome you to our community and know that we have a lot to learn from each other. And I want to remind us all that this year, the imam of the mosque that we've been at for this year came and spoke to us on gay pride. And he did it, and he publicly identified himself as a cisgendered, heterosexual imam, and he was here to speak to the gay community in the Jewish world. He did that publicly. I was once on a panel discussion with him where somebody asked him the ISIS question, you know, a version of what you're saying, and he said, do you understand that ISIS wants to kill me before they want to kill any of you? You know, don't be so, in other words, he said it also more gently, he said, don't be so narcissistic. ISIS wants to get rid of progressive Muslims a lot faster and is much more dangerous than those of us who are not Muslim. And our liberation will be when we stand next to each other and say that my liberation is tied with yours. And to the extent we have to have a lot of curiosity about each other, let's be curious. And so I'm really thrilled that our House of Peace project here, led by our two fearless leaders and Rabbi Marisa James and all who show up, are about showing up regularly and not saying do it on our terms, but really we're there. And we're gonna and the other thing is people make mistakes when we actually start to deeply get to know each other. That's okay. And part of getting to know each other deeply is making some mistakes. But to be able to sit and listen to you, fantastic. Please know that we consider you now honorary members of our broadly constituted CBST, and we offer you our blessings. So thank you very much.
And is the live stream still? I want to thank you to everyone on the live stream. The materials that we handed out tonight that you didn't get to see will be on our website on Monday. So check back on the live stream for the link to that. And for all of you who are here, inshallah, yes, indeed. For all of you who are here, please know that this is on our Facebook page. If there's somebody who you know and love who you'd like to share this with, you'll be able to do that as well because the video is now going to be on our Facebook page. Thank you all. In Hebrew we say Tzedchem l'shalom, go in peace. Ma'asalame in Arabic, go in peace.